Emily Thomas had always lived a life wrapped in quiet struggle. Orphaned at 8, she had no siblings, no relatives willing to care for her, and no inheritance, just a little hut made of earth, a garden she tended herself, and a fierce determination to survive. To the rest of the village, she was that hard-working girl, quiet, polite, but distant. She fetched water, helped elderly women with their farms, and tutored children in exchange for food or coins. Despite the hardship, Emily had something rare: hope. Her dream was to become a lawyer. She had no formal education beyond the basics. Her only glimpse into the world of law came from worn-out books left behind by a retired schoolteacher. Still, she read every night by lantern light, whispered courtroom speeches to herself, and believed that one day she would stand up for those like her, poor, voiceless, forgotten. Then one day, a stranger arrived. He introduced himself as Daniel. He was tall, dusty from travel, dressed simply, and carried nothing but a brown backpack. He said little about himself, only that he was looking for work, peace, and a fresh start. Most people ignored him. A few mocked him. But Emily saw something in his eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. She offered him water and roasted yam. He thanked her, and from that moment, a quiet friendship began. Daniel did small jobs, fixing fences, lifting goods, helping in the fields. He never asked for more than he needed. He spent his evenings under the same mango tree where Emily studied, talking with her about dreams and regrets. She told him about her dream of becoming a lawyer. He listened. What Emily didn't know was that Daniel was hiding the biggest truth of all. He was Daniel Harris, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country. He had left his privileged life behind to find something real, something true, and in Emily he was beginning to find it. But could he trust it? So he decided to test her love before revealing who he truly was. As the days passed, Daniel fell deeper into Emily's world. He admired her spirit, how she gave freely even when she had little, how she didn't pity herself, how she believed in justice despite having known nothing but struggle. One quiet evening beneath the mango tree, he asked her, "Why law?" She looked at the stars and answered, "Because nobody spoke for my father when he died, or for my mother when she got sick and was turned away. I want to become the kind of person who speaks for the ones everyone ignores." Daniel swallowed hard. "You'd be a powerful voice." Emily smiled. "If dreams were enough, I'd already be there." He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He loved her. But did she love him, or just the version of him she knew? And so he vanished. No goodbyes, no explanations, just a letter delivered the next day by a boy. "Emily, I've had to leave. I found work far away, but I'm in trouble. I don't know if I'll make it back. If you still care, come find me. Ask for a man named Musa. He'll help you, Daniel." Emily read it over and over.
She had no money.
Nothing of value. But the next morning she sold her only goat, packed the few clothes she had, and set out on foot, determined to find him. Hours later, dusty and tired, she stepped down from a crowded bus, holding his letter close. Daniel, watching from a distance, felt his heart break open. She came, she chose him. It was no longer a test, it was love. When Emily saw Daniel step out from the black SUV, she froze. He wasn't wearing the torn clothes she remembered. He stood straight, clean-shaven, wearing a tailored shirt and polished shoes. He looked powerful. Her heart raced. "Daniel, my name is Daniel Harris," he said. "My family owns a large corporation. I left it all to find something real. I found you!" Emily blinked, shocked. "You lied." "I hid, but I never lied about how I feel." She looked down, confused, hurt. Then he handed her an envelope. Inside, an admission letter, a full scholarship to law school. Her name on the paper, her dream on the page. Emily stared at him, trembling. "You once told me you'd do anything to study law. Let me give you that chance." Her voice cracked. "You didn't have to buy my dream." "I didn't," he said. "I just want to see you become everything I already know you are." Tears welled in her eyes. "I need time." Daniel nodded. "Take all the time you need. But remember, this was never about money. It was always about you." Emily started school with fierce focus. She sat in the front row, asked the hardest questions, studied through the night. She refused to be seen as the girl who was helped. She wanted to be the girl who earned it. Daniel supported her quietly, sending books, study materials, and encouraging notes. He visited occasionally, but never flaunted their relationship. Still, people talked. She must be using him. She probably lied to get here. He'll dump her soon. Emily kept her head down, but the weight of their whispers clung to her like smoke. And far away, Daniel's uncle, Gregory Harris, was fuming. She's a threat, he told the board. She has no pedigree. She'll ruin our name. Daniel didn't care. But Gregory wasn't finished. He hired investigators, dug into Emily's past, and found it a single forgotten police report. Emily had once been accused of theft. When she was 15, stealing bread to feed a starving child in her care. The case had been dropped, but Gregory had what he needed. He leaked it to the press. And the next day, the headlines screamed, "Billionaire's girlfriend has a criminal past." Was it love or a scam? Emily woke up to a storm. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages poured in. Her name trended for the wrong reasons. And Daniel, he was silent. She called once, twice, dozens of times. No answer. The silence crushed her. At school, students stared, whispered, laughed. Her professors treated her differently. One cancelled her tutorial without explanation. Emily went home and cried harder than she had in years. Not for the lies, not for the cruelty, but because the one person she trusted had disappeared when she needed him most. But Daniel hadn't abandoned her. He was sitting in a boardroom full of advisors, being told to cut her off. She's a liability. You're risking everything. She played you. Daniel stood. If loving her costs me everything, then so be it. Then he left, drove all night. At dawn, he knocked on her door. She opened it, eyes red, barely able to speak. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have come sooner, but I'm here now." Emily broke. "You left me." I froze. "But I won't ever do that again." She sobbed into his chest. "You never lost me," he said. "And you never will." Daniel's apology wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Emily knew that if she wanted to survive what was coming, she couldn't just hide behind love. She had to rise. So she did. She started by walking into her next class with her head high, ignoring the murmurs, the stares, and the silent judgment of professors who had once praised her. She answered questions with precision, debated with logic, and refused to shrink. And then she spoke. One afternoon, during a student panel on access to justice, she stood in front of a packed room and shared her story. Not the headlines, not the twisted blog version, the truth. She spoke of being an orphan, of hunger, of the desperation that led her at 15 to steal a loaf of bread, of being dragged to the police station for trying to keep a sick child alive, of how the case was dropped when a kind elder spoke for her, but the memory of shame never left. And then, with tears in her eyes, she said, "If we punish people forever for being poor, then justice isn't blind, it's broken. I didn't steal because I was evil. I stole because I was hungry. That's not a crime, that's survival." The auditorium fell silent. Her words spread. A recording of her speech made its way online. It went viral, not because she was connected to Daniel Harris, but because her truth had power. Suddenly, the story shifted. Orphan girl turned law student speaks truth to power. Daniel Harris's girlfriend gives emotional speech on justice and forgiveness. And then came an invitation. Emily was asked to join a student legal clinic team advocating for abandoned women and children. She accepted. Meanwhile, Daniel faced another kind of war. Gregory, furious that his smear campaign had backfired, began maneuvering within the family business. He called emergency meetings, rallied board members, and whispered fear into their ears. "We can't let Daniel take over. He's reckless, emotional, weak." What he didn't know was that Daniel had been preparing. Daniel called a meeting of his own, this time with his legal team and a few old board allies, who had stood by his late father. "I'm not going to fight Gregory with threats," Daniel said. "I'm going to fight him with transparency." He exposed Gregory's backroom dealings, his misuse of company funds, and his deliberate sabotage of internal projects. And when the evidence was presented to the board, Gregory's face turned pale. The final vote was swift. Gregory was removed from the executive board. That night, Daniel drove straight to Emily's place. She was sitting on the steps, barefoot, flipping through her notes. When she saw him, she smiled, not the shy, nervous smile from when they first met, but one that belonged to a woman who had survived fire and still stood tall. "It's done," he said. "Gregory's out." She stood and walked to him. "And what now?" He took her hands gently. "Now," he said, "we live." But Emily wasn't done. She had tasted something greater than love, purpose. She continued her studies, spoke at conferences, volunteered with legal aid groups, and became a voice for those who had been silenced by circumstance. Daniel supported her but never stood in front of her. He let her lead. He celebrated her wins. He protected her peace. They had arguments, moments of doubt, even days of silence. But through it all, one thing remained unshaken. Their love was real. 3 years passed like chapters in a novel, full of struggle, victories, and unspoken prayers, answered Emily. Thomas graduated top of her class. She had walked across the graduation stage in a black gown with trembling steps and a roaring heart. Daniel was there in the front row, standing before anyone else, clapping with the force of 10,000 hands. He had sent her flowers, but also silence, so she could own her moment without his shadow. That night, they sat in the quiet of their shared apartment, eating suya and laughing like old friends. "You did it," Daniel said softly. Emily looked at him, eyes glistening. "We did it." He shook his head. "No, you walked through fire, Emily. I just held the door open." She leaned into him, heart full. "And now it's your turn to let me fight for you." Emily began her legal career working with a rising human rights firm. She rejected every invitation to work for luxury corporate brands or elite legal chambers that offered money and power. What she wanted was justice, raw, honest, and complicated. Her first major case came quietly, a widow, thrown out of her home by her late husband's brothers. A common story, too common. But this time the widow had Emily. Emily fought the case like it was personal. In a way, it was. Every woman she defended reminded her of her mother. Every child watching from the sidelines reminded her of herself. Daniel came to every hearing, sat at the back, made no noise, just watched, eyes locked on the woman he loved as she argued, stood tall, made judges pause, and made opponents sweat. After weeks of battling the system, Emily won. The widow wept into her hands. Emily walked out of court and collapsed into Daniel's arms. "This is what I was made for," she whispered. "I know," he said. "And I'm going to spend my life watching you change the world." But joy never lives unchallenged. Back at Daniel's company, a scandal broke out. A data leak. A whistleblower. A former executive claimed Daniel was illegally shifting funds to personal projects, including Emily's education. The media storm returned with fangs. Did billionaire pay his lover's way with company money? Sources claim Emily Thomas received private funding from Harris Group without board approval. Daniel's business empire shook. Emily's name was dragged into financial headlines. This time it wasn't her past, it was her integrity. She was furious. "You built this company long before I came," she said to Daniel. "Why do they want to make me the stain on your legacy?" "Because they're afraid of women like you," he replied. "They know you have more power with your voice than they ever had with their money." But Emily wasn't going to stand back. She called a press conference, not as Daniel's fiancée, not as a victim, but as barrister Emily Thomas. In a simple black suit, she stood before flashing cameras and answered every question with calm, clarity, and unshakable grace. "I have never received a single naira from Harris Group that was not from Daniel's personal income," she stated. "All documentation will be made available today. I was sponsored by the man I love, not the company he inherited. If the world cannot separate a man from his business, or a woman from her ambition, then the real scandal is not me, it's all of you." The room fell silent. The media changed its tune. And behind the curtain, Daniel smiled like a man watching the future unfold. The storm calmed. The media retreated. The truth stood. Emily had silenced a room, full of doubters with the power of her words. And Daniel knew, without question, that this was the woman he wanted to marry. So he began planning, not a flashy proposal, Not one with drone footage and diamonds blinding enough to make headlines. He wanted a quiet moment under the mango tree where they first met. He had bought a simple ring, elegant, not loud. He rehearsed his words late at night when she was asleep, practicing in front of the mirror like a nervous schoolboy. But just days before he could ask her, a phone call shattered everything. Emily's voice trembled as she dropped her phone, her knees giving way beneath her. Daniel rushed to her side. "What is it?" Her voice cracked. "Mama OG." She's gone. Mama OG had been the closest thing Emily had to family, a surrogate grandmother, the woman who had vouched for her when she was 15, who gave her cassava to eat when the world gave her silence. She had passed away in her sleep. The funeral was modest and tear-soaked. Emily stood over the old woman's casket, clutching a white cloth in her hands. Her grief so quiet it was deafening. Daniel tried to comfort her, but Emily withdrew. "I need to be alone," she whispered. He respected her space. But each day she pulled further back into herself, into memories, into wounds that had never fully healed. She stopped answering messages, skipped work, didn't return his calls, even when he was in the same house. One night she finally spoke. "I spent so much of my life losing people," she said softly, staring at the rain tapping against the window. "First my parents, then my childhood, then the dignity that poverty steals from you, one coin at a time. And now her. I keep wondering when it's your turn, Daniel." He took a step toward her. "I'm not going anywhere." "You say that now," she whispered. "But the world is always changing. And good things, good people, they leave. I'm still here." "But for how long?" she asked, eyes wide with fear. Daniel took her face in his hands. "As long as it takes for you to believe that I'm not leaving." She cried then, loud, aching sobs that years of silence had stored up. And in his arms she let herself grieve. The next morning, Emily stood at the doorway, the sun rising behind her, and said, "Let's go to the tree." Daniel knew what she meant. They walked hand in hand, no guards, no staff, no distractions. Just them, just like the beginning, under the wide shade of the mango tree. He reached into his pocket and brought out the ring. "I was going to ask you last week," he said with a smile, "but I didn't want to interrupt the storm." She chuckled through her tears. "I've always loved storms. They remind me that even the sky breaks down sometimes." Daniel went to one knee. "Emily Thomas, will you be my forever?" She didn't cry this time. She smiled and nodded. "Yes." The days after the proposal were like a dream. Emily wore her engagement ring the way she wore her voice, with quiet pride. Daniel didn't just look at her with love anymore. He looked at her with awe. The girl who had once washed cassava for pennies was now a rising attorney, a future wife, and a force no one could deny. Preparations for the wedding began. They chose a private ceremony. No press, no sponsors, just their closest friends, a handful of mentors, and a garden covered in white roses. Emily wanted to walk barefoot. Daniel agreed. She wanted no makeup, just the face he'd fallen in love with under the mango tree. He agreed again, but as plans came together, so did trouble. It began with a letter, a thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address, delivered to Daniel's office. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature stopped his breath. Clara. Daniel hadn't heard that name in years. Clara had been his first love. Before the wealth, before the inheritance, before the pressure. They had been young and foolish, believing love alone could conquer all. But Clara had left him, abruptly, and bitterly, after rumors that Daniel's father had offered her money to walk away. Daniel had searched for her, but eventually gave up when the trail ran cold. Now she was back. And the letter wasn't just sentimental. She wanted to meet, in person, urgently, Daniel told Emily. She listened, quiet and unreadable. Then softly, "Are you going?" "I think I should," he replied. "Not because I have feelings for her, but because I need to know why now." Emily nodded, but her eyes dimmed. "Be careful." They met in a quiet restaurant. Clara looked different, older but still elegant. Her smile was strained. "I didn't come to cause problems," she said. "I just thought you should know." "You were right back then. Your father did offer me money to leave you. I refused at first, but my family was drowning in debt. I took it." Daniel clenched his jaw. "And now you're here because—" "I'm sick," she said simply. I don't want anything from you. No money, no second chance. I just needed you to know I never stopped loving you. I just couldn't be poor anymore." He stared at her, speechless. Clara leaned forward, voice low. "You chose well. She's nothing like me." When Daniel told Emily everything, she listened again. Then she asked the question that had haunted her for days. "If she hadn't left you, would you have still come to the village? Would you have ever met me?" Daniel looked at her, pain on his face. "I don't know." She nodded. "That's what scares me." He stepped closer. "Emily, she's a chapter. You are the whole story." The night before the wedding, Emily sat alone, thinking. The past was messy. Love wasn't clean. But in her heart, she knew one thing. Daniel had chosen her, again and again, and she had chosen him. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was real. The wedding day dawned with soft winds and sunbeams, scattered like gold across the earth. It was everything they had hoped for, modest, quiet, sacred. No reporters, no stage lights, just chairs wrapped in white linen, tables lined with native flowers, and the tree. Their tree, where Daniel had first sat, dusty and uncertain, and where Emily had offered him food and conversation, not knowing he'd one day change her life. Guests arrived in warm waves, colleagues from the legal world, a few of Daniel's close business allies, old women from Emily's childhood, and one little boy who used to carry water with her down the red path. He was taller now, but when she saw him, she cried. The ceremony began just before sunset. Daniel stood in a simple black suit, his heart racing not from nerves, but reverence. Then Emily appeared. She wore a white gown with no lace, no train, no veil. Her hair was tied back in a soft knot, and on her wrist was a simple leather bracelet that Daniel had given her in their early days, when they sat under the stars and shared dreams neither thought would come true. As she walked toward him, Daniel forgot how to breathe. She was not just beautiful. She was his beginning, his battle, his home. The officiant welcomed the guests and spoke briefly. There were no long religious rituals, no readings from rehearsed scripts. Then it was time for the vows. Daniel took her hands, trembling slightly. "Emily," he began, "I came to you as a man with nothing, no name, no money, no plan. And still you saw me. You fed me. You laughed with me. You believed in me. You taught me that love doesn't chase riches. Love chooses. Love waits. Love sacrifices. And today, I vow to spend every day proving to you that I will never forget that. You are the reason I believe in second chances. In grace, in truth." Emily swallowed hard, tears glistening. "Daniel," she said, her voice clear but full of emotion, "when I met you, I had nothing but scars and an old dream. I thought life would break me. I had been abandoned so many times. I never thought love would come wrapped in rags, holding a letter instead of a ring. But you didn't just find me. You chose me, again and again. And I vow today to walk beside you when the sun shines and when the roof leaks. I don't need wealth. I don't need protection. I just need your heart. Because with you, I have everything I ever prayed for." The guests were crying. Even the flowers seemed to lean closer to hear. And when the vows were sealed with a kiss, there was no orchestra. Just birds, breeze, and the sound of hearts finally exhaling. But just as the sun dipped, a car pulled up. Out stepped Clara. She stayed far from the crowd, just watching. Emily saw her. Their eyes met. Clara gave a soft nod. No malice, just acceptance. She had come to release the last of what she carried, and to see the man she once loved find the life she couldn't give him. Emily nodded back gently, then turned to Daniel and whispered, "We're free." That night, under the stars, Daniel and Emily danced barefoot under the mango tree. No lights, no speeches, just the hush of night and the strength of everything they'd endured. No longer orphan and stranger, now husband and wife, now forever. The honeymoon was quiet, not a luxury island escape or a tour across oceans, just a cabin surrounded by trees, the soft murmur of a nearby stream, and days filled with slow mornings, reading in silence, and kisses that tasted like home. Emily and Daniel had both lived lives that moved too fast, fought too hard. Now they allowed themselves the rare gift of rest. But peace, for people with purpose, never lingers too long. On their 6th day away, Emily received a call from her mentor at the firm. "We have a crisis," the voice said, "and I need our best." Emily almost said no. She looked at Daniel, who was tracing the curve of her hand with his thumb, and saw the worry begin to form. "Tell me everything," she replied. The case was simple on the surface, devastating underneath. A 10-year-old boy had been taken from his mother by social workers, accused of being part of a trafficking ring. The woman had no lawyer, no money, and no family to speak for her. The child had been placed in a temporary shelter. The mother claimed innocence. The government claimed evidence. But something didn't sit right. "I'll take it," Emily said. "You're sure?" her mentor asked. "You just got married." "I didn't get married to slow down," Emily replied. "I got married to walk beside someone who understands that some fires are worth burning for." Daniel supported her without hesitation. He helped pack their bags and held her hand all the way home. "Are you worried?" she asked. "Not about the case," he replied. "Only that you'll forget to eat when you get consumed. Just promise me one thing." She tilted her head. "Promise me you'll let me take care of you, even when you're busy taking care of everyone else." She nodded. "Deal." Emily dove into the case. She met the boy, quiet, trembling, with eyes that flinched at every sudden sound. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't smile. But when Emily offered him her biscuit, he took it. Then she met the mother, thin-worn, eyes swollen from weeping. "I didn't sell him," she whispered. "I didn't hurt him. He's my only child. I cleaned houses to feed him. Why would I give him away?" Emily believed her. But the evidence was stacked. Fake documents, a misleading witness, and a social worker who seemed far too eager to close the case. Emily worked through the nights. She missed dinners, slept at her desk. Daniel would stop by, leave food, kiss her head, and quietly leave again. They weren't in their honeymoon phase anymore. They were in the real-life phase, and somehow it was even more beautiful. In court, Emily dismantled the prosecution's story piece by piece. She showed how the child's school records had been forged, how the mother's employer had been coerced into giving a false statement, and how the witness had once attempted to blackmail the mother months before. When the judge finally dismissed the case and ordered the boy to be reunited with his mother, the courtroom erupted in quiet applause. The mother sobbed. The boy clung to her like breath. "And Emily?" She cried too, not because she had won, but because justice had. That night, Daniel waited at home with 2 glasses of wine and a quiet playlist humming in the background. When Emily walked in, exhausted but glowing, he stood and opened his arms. She walked straight into them. "Another fire?" he asked. She nodded against his chest. "But this one, we put it out." The news came on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped casually into conversation over lunch. Daniel swirled his drink and said, "I got a call this morning. The board approved the expansion." Emily looked up from her food, eyes shining with curiosity. "That's amazing. What does that mean?" He hesitated for a moment. "They want me to lead it. Full control. A new branch, new team, new vision." She smiled. "You've earned that." He reached for her hand. "But there's more. The project's overseas. I'd have to move for at least 2 years." The room fell quiet, not tense, just still. Emily placed her fork down slowly. 2 years? He nodded. "It's a huge step. A dream, really. One I didn't even know I had until now." She didn't speak immediately, not because she didn't want to, but because she was calculating the weight of the decision between her ribs. That evening, they sat on the floor of their living room, eating from the same bowl, her head resting on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Daniel finally asked. Emily inhaled deeply. "That I love you. That I love what I do. That I love the people who depend on me. That I don't know how to stretch my heart wide enough to hold all of it at once." He kissed the top of her head. "I don't want you to abandon anything, and I don't want to give you ultimatums. I just want us to be honest." She nodded, silent. Over the next few days, they lived in soft dissonance, laughing, touching, talking, but always with the unspoken question floating in the air like a song without an ending. Who do we become when we're no longer walking the same path? Daniel prepared for meetings with the foreign team. Emily poured herself into the legal aid center, where her latest case involved an elderly man defrauded by his own son. They didn't fight. They just didn't know what to say. Until one night, under the tree that had witnessed the beginning of their story, Emily broke the silence. "If you asked me to go, I would." Daniel looked up sharply. "I'd never ask that. But I'd do it," she continued. "Because I love you. Because you followed me into my fire. Because you held me when the world spit me out." She paused. "But I also know, if I leave now, I'll be leaving the people who need me most. I'm not ready." He stared at her for a long time, then reached for her hand. "I think," he said, "we can love each other deeply, without standing in the same room every day. I think you and I were built with roots deep enough to survive oceans." Her eyes glistened. "You think we can survive the distance?" "I think," he said softly, "we were born for it." And so the decision was made. Daniel left. Emily stayed, not because they were falling apart, but because they believed in what they had enough to let it bend without breaking. Every night they spoke. Not always long conversations, sometimes just a video call, a text, a shared song, a photo of the tree. They stayed close. They stayed true. Months passed. Emily threw herself into her work, and the world began to notice. Her victories in court, her clarity in interviews, her unwavering passion for justice. People took note. She was invited to panels, offered features in major publications, and soon nominated for a national humanitarian award. At night, she shared the milestones with Daniel. He listened from hotel rooms and boardrooms, always smiling, always proud, always watching the love of his life become more than he ever imagined. But distance doesn't just stretch the body. It tests the soul. One evening, Emily was getting ready for a televised legal panel when Daniel called. "I'm flying back next week," he said, his voice rich with excitement. "That's amazing." "For how long?" she asked, brushing her hair in front of the mirror. He hesitated. "Only 4 days." Her hand froze midair. "4? I know it's short, but there's a meeting in between. And then I have to return. I'm sorry." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay, because she missed him. Missed his hands, his presence, the way he looked at her when she walked into a room, without makeup and messy hair, and he said, "You're still the most powerful thing I've ever seen." Meanwhile, on Daniel's side of the world, the pressure was growing. The expansion was taking off. Investors were biting, profits were climbing. But one thing stood in the way: Emily. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she refused to be silent. She stood for justice in a world that preferred convenience. She criticized corporations. She called out inequality. She made powerful people uncomfortable. And one of those powerful people was Tony Vance, Daniel's international operations director. Tony had been with the company for years, smart, ruthless. She didn't like Emily, and she didn't hide it. "Your girlfriend is a liability," she told Daniel in a closed-door meeting. "My wife," he corrected. "Right. Well, your activist wife is making headlines for all the wrong reasons. If we lose that partnership deal because she calls out our supplier practices in public again, you're going to have to make a choice." Daniel stood. "I already did, years ago." Tony didn't flinch. "Then I hope she's worth the empire you're about to lose." Emily's big night arrived. The panel was streamed live, and she was brilliant, bold, honest. She spoke of injustice, of compassion, and how companies should be held accountable not only for their profits, but for the people they affect. The next morning, Daniel's name was trending, with hers. "Wife of CEO criticizes corporate supply chains, conflict of interest." The board was furious. Tony, grinning behind a calm facade, took it further. She leaked something, a voice note, a conversation Daniel had recorded a year ago during the scandal with Gregory. It was personal, raw, emotional. In the note, Daniel had said, "If I have to choose between love and legacy, I'll choose her, even if I regret it later." The media twisted it. Daniel Harris said he may regret marrying Emily. Emily saw it and froze. She didn't call. She didn't cry. She just shut down. Daniel called her non-stop, no answer. He left messages, no reply. When he flew back and showed up at her door, she opened it with a straight face. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "I regret letting people like Tony control the narrative. I regret not warning you. But you, us, never." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Then show them," she whispered. "Don't protect me by hiding me. Let the world see us for what we are, messy, real, powerful." 2 days later, Daniel and Emily gave a joint interview, open, raw, unrehearsed. They talked about their story from the beginning, about deception, forgiveness, struggle, dreams, power, loss, and what it meant to love someone when the cameras weren't watching. They didn't perform, they just told the truth, and the world listened. The storm had passed. After the interview, public opinion shifted. What once was a circus of scandal softened into admiration. Articles began to change tone. "Love in the Time of Power, the Harris Thomas story." Can authenticity survive in the hands of the wealthy? Maybe, yes. Emily returned to court. Daniel returned to strategy. But something in both of them had shifted, like they had crossed a river. They could never uncross. Then an offer came. Daniel was called into a closed-door meeting with the board. Not for reprimand, this time for opportunity. "The expansion has outperformed expectations," the chairman said. "We want a permanent global base, and we want you to lead it with full autonomy." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "It's a 10-year plan. We're offering full authority over assets, teams, operations, but it must be managed from there. In person, no delegation, no remote arrangement." He paused. "And one more thing. We want Emily to step away from public legal advocacy while you're in this role. Too many overlapping interests." Daniel didn't reply. He simply stood up and walked out. He had come too far to be told again that loving the right woman was the wrong decision. That night he told Emily everything. She sat still as he spoke, eyes steady. Then she said, 10 years? He nodded. "And if you say yes, I'd have to walk away from my work." He shook his head slowly. "You wouldn't. I would never ask that of you. But they are, and I won't let them." She smiled, but her heart twisted. "What are we doing, Daniel? We love each other, but the world keeps demanding we live separate lives. I fought so hard to become myself. I can't disappear now." "Not even for you." "I know," he whispered. They spent the next few days in silence. They ate together, sat together, even slept beside each other. But the weight of what lingered between them was louder than words. And then, one morning, Daniel woke up and she was gone. Not in anger, not in pain, just gone. On the pillow, a note. "You once left to find your truth. Now I must protect mine. If love brought us here, love will bring us home again." Weeks passed. Daniel declined the board's offer. He didn't tell anyone why. He simply returned to the very place where the story began. The old house, the mango tree, the silence, the soil. He waited. And one quiet afternoon, as the wind shifted and the sky softened, a car pulled up. She stepped out, wearing jeans, a white blouse, and that same calm fierceness he had fallen in love with. She walked up to him. "Why didn't you chase me?" she asked. "I was waiting," he said, voice thick, "because I didn't want to catch you if you were still meant to fly." She smiled. "You were right," she whispered. "Love did bring me home." Emily didn't say much that first day back. She walked with Daniel around the land near the old mango tree. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. Their silence had become a language only they understood. Later, as they sat on the wooden bench where they'd once shared roasted yam, Emily finally spoke. "I've realized something," she said quietly. "Love isn't about what you give up. It's about what you build, even when you're building it apart." Daniel turned to her. "And what are we building now?" She looked at him, soft and sure. "A life where no one has to shrink for the other to shine." They began slowly. Daniel declined all relocation offers. Instead, he built a new branch of the company right where Emily's work was rooted, a local innovation hub, employing young tech minds, funding ethical businesses, and most importantly, letting him be present. Emily, in turn, launched her own legal foundation, focusing on cases involving women and children, with Daniel's quiet financial backing, but her public leadership. The foundation became a lighthouse for those left in the shadows. They were busy, independent, powerful, and still always in love. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs validation from headlines or applause, but the kind that shows up, that waits, that chooses again and again. Years passed. Emily became one of the country's most respected legal advocates. Daniel turned his company into a model of corporate responsibility. They built a home with wide windows, a library, and a nursery they both took turns painting because one spring morning they welcomed a little girl into the world. They named her Grace because that's what carried them. That's what held them when everything else threatened to fall. Grace and a love neither time, distance, nor pressure could kill. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, they returned once again to that mango tree. Emily rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "You remember when I first fed you under this tree?" she whispered. He chuckled. "You gave me burnt yam and water in a tin cup. And you gave me a letter I almost didn't believe," she smiled. "But it led me here." He kissed her forehead. "Wherever here is, it's always better with you in it." She looked out at the sunset. The tree, the land, their home, their daughter laughing in the distance. Their story. Not perfect, but honest. Not ordinary, but deeply, beautifully real. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notification so you don't miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for tuning in.